Welcome to Cultivating Wisdom with John Vervaeke. We are streaming every Saturday at 10 AM Eastern, and I'm glad to have you here. If you're joining us for the first time, we've been doing this, I think, since April, and we did an entire meditation and contemplation course drawn from the Eastern traditions of Buddhism and Taoism. And then we started a course based on McClelland's book, The Wisdom of Hypatia, that's designed to take us through the Western wisdom traditions, Epicureanism, Stoicism, and now we're into Neoplatonism. So there's a lot there. So I recommend going to the links in the description, taking a look at Lesson 1, working your way through the Meditating with John Vervaeke course, also going back to the first lesson of the Wisdom of Hypatia, working your way through there, maybe one lesson of each per week. You can continue to meet with us regularly. So, it would be helpful to me if you could like this stream to increase its visibility in the YouTube algorithm. And we will, as always, begin by sitting together. We'll begin by chanting, then we'll go into a silent sit, and then we will have a Dharma talk, or as like I said, maybe we should now call it, because we're in the Western tradition, of the Logos talk, and continuing our background on Neoplatonism. Hopefully we'll get through the background today, and then over the next few weeks we'll go through some of the practices that are drawn from Neoplatonism that are designed to afford, I think, a very profound cultivation of wisdom. I think the profundity of the Neoplatonic ecology of practices is equivalent to the profundity found within the Buddhist and Taoist wisdom traditions. So let's begin. So get yourself into a comfortable position, set your phones on Do Not Disturb, and as I said, we'll begin together. When I say begin, we'll begin by chanting, and then I'll indicate when we go into a silent sit, and then we'll switch cameras and I'll move to the whiteboard. So, begin. Om. Begin your silent sit. slowly come out of your practice, trying as best you can to integrate what you cultivated in your practice with your everyday consciousness, cognition, character, and communitas, perhaps by reciting the 5 promises to yourself. Okay, we're going to switch camera now. So, trying to give you the background to Neoplatonism, like I did for Epicureanism and Stoicism. It's more complex, of course, than Epicureanism and Stoicism, because as I've indicated, Neoplatonism is the grand unified field theory of the Western wisdom traditions, of Western spirituality. I agree with Arthur verse Lewis. I think he's made the case very clear, Pierre Hadot and others, that Neoplatonism is the cultural cognitive grammar of Western spirituality. So if you want to get to the depths of all of the great spiritual traditions, and I mean the West very broadly, I'm including Sufism here, right? Then you need to understand Neoplatonism. So we're taking some time on this, and I pointed out to you that Neoplatonism draws from several different of the traditions and sources of wisdom in order to bring about its very powerful integration. And that integration, of course, was so powerful that, as I've mentioned, it's taken up into Christian mysticism, Jewish mysticism, Islamic mysticism, and perhaps some others, but that's enough for now. Okay, so what did we get from Plato? Obviously, Plato is the central figure of Neoplatonism. If you had asked any of the Neoplatonists if they were Neoplatonists, they wouldn't say that. That's our term for them. They thought of themselves as followers of Plato. So we're spending a lot of time on Plato because he's the most significant source we want to talk about here. So last time we took a look at the notion of the tripartite, the 3-part psyche. Tripartite psyche, and the idea is we can look at the psyche divided into 3 parts. There's a part of us that's like a monster. It's the appetitive part, and it works in terms of sort of superficial properties, very short term. And then we have another part of us that's the thymos. It's in the chest. That's the part of us that's a sociocultural being, and this one works more long term. It works in terms not of pleasure and pain, but of honor and shame. And then we have the part of us that's the rational part. It works in terms of abstract thought, long-term goals. And the idea is reason on its own is impotent for dealing with our monstrous appetites. But the idea is if we teach the man, he can then train the lion, and the lion is powerful enough to tame the monster. And we're we can think of Stoicism as basically that. What we're doing is when we're engaging in these individual and group practices. The individual practices, we're sort of teaching the man, but in the group practices, what we're doing is integrating reason with our sociality, and that's what dialogue and dialectic and dialogos, we'll talk about those later, are. What you're doing is you're basically getting an integration of your capacity to reason and your capacity for sociality, for internalization, for distributed cognition, integrated together, and then that integration tames the monster. That's why, of course, when people want to make a significant change, and all the evidence really supports this, whether or not they acknowledge it explicitly, they put aside all of the North American bullshit about individualism, and they join a group. Because you may get all the correct belief and knowledge for bringing about the change, but until you integrate the man with the lion, you're actually not going to get the power you need, the transformative power, to tame the monster. And of course, that's very deeply analogous to the Buddhist tradition of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Okay, and then what we noted is the point is not to kill the monster, right? The point is to get a kind of inner justice, sophrosyn, an inner justice between these three so that they have the greatest mutual life possible, so that they can live together the best they possibly can. And is that not ultimately what justice was supposed to mean? And so we have a fullness of being. And what that does is it reduces our inner conflict, but as we talked about it last time, it also starts to reduce our capacity for self-deception. And as we start to reduce the capacity for self-deception, we start to pick up on real patterns in the world. And of course, all of our knowledge endeavors, we talked about science last time, are trying to distinguish the real patterns from the illusory patterns. And then the idea is, as we get better at, and I'm using this word deliberately, realization, becoming aware of the real patterns, we get better at realizing, right, the patterns within our own psyche. We get better at optimizing the relationship between the psyche. We reduce our inner conflict. We reduce that inner storm that distorts and clouds our vision. And as the clouds of inner conflict and inner storm part, we see more deeply into the light of the world. And this does this. It's a virtuous cycle. And this is the cycle of anagage, in which we ascend. This means ascend. And I'll give you the parable for that in a second. And then the idea here is two of our deepest meta drives are being satisfied in a mutually supporting fashion. Above and beyond reaching whatever goals we reach, we want to reach those goals and have peace of mind. In fact, many people will reliably say, I'll give you this goal, but it's going to cause significant inner conflict, and say, no, forget it. I don't want the goal then. I'll change my goal. So we have a meta drive of inner peace, and then we also have a meta drive that whatever goal we're satisfying, the thing that is causing the satisfaction of the goal is real rather than fraudulent or illusory. And so we're satisfying these two deepest meta drives, and we are getting more and more deeply connected to ourselves and the world. This is massively enhancing meaning in life, and this is giving us a fullness of being, both inner fullness of being and outer fullness of being. And this whole process is a process of realization in both senses of the word, actualizing and coming into deeper awareness. So this is, I think this is just a profound series of insights on Plato's part. So Plato tells a story. It's a parable. It's meant to be understood as a parable. Sometimes called the analogy. Sometimes I like calling it a parable because I think it's much more like the parables, for example, of the Buddha or Jesus of Nazareth. And the parable goes like this. Imagine a bunch of people, they're in a cave underground, right? And they've been chained into chairs. Here's a chair, and here's the wall of a cave. And back here there's a fire burning. It's casting shadows. And there's people walking by. And the people that are here are chained. And all they can see is this wall. And they're seeing the shadows being cast onto the wall. And they're hearing the echoes of the people walking by the shadow, walking by the fire, carrying various objects. And then the idea is these people think that the shadows, right, are real, and they think the sounds are actually coming from the shadows rather than being echoes of their true sources. And then the idea is one person struggles and turns around, metanoia, and realizes the situation, somehow gets free and sees the fire and realizes, notice the language I keep having to use, that the shadows and the echoes aren't real. They're actually being generated by the more real objects and people. And the person uses the fire to understand more what's going on. And then that by the firelight, the person sees that there's actually a path leading up. And the path leads up to the world. And so the person is making an ascent. The Greek word for ascent is anagage. So how does that fit in with what I was telling you? Well, think about what happens. The person starts to walk up the path, and the light blinds them because their eyes are not used to it. And so their eyes first have to accommodate to the overwhelming light, and then once the eyes accommodate, they can actually see farther along the path. So then they move farther along the path, they get more light, they have to accommodate, and then they can see farther. And you see what's going on here? The light transforms their sight so they can see further, which takes them further into the light, which transforms their sight until they can make their way out onto the surface. Now they're in a different world, and they're seeing in a way that they never saw before. They have experienced enlightenment. I mean, Plato has this notion as well. This is not just a Buddhist notion. They have been, right, opened to the light. They have been transformed so they can see in terms of a greater and more real light. Okay, so now the person is, again, in this world. They're kind of blinded by the light. Eventually they accommodate, and they want to find the source. They see that everything's alive, there's energy, there's warmth, there's light, right? There's light, and they want to see, just like they saw the source of the shadows, they want to find the source of the real light and the real life and the real world that they're in. And they, of course, look around, and eventually they look up, and they can never fully look at it because it's too overwhelming. But they can glimpse the sun and how it exceeds their capacity to see, it exceeds their capacity to understand. And they're so overwhelmed by this vision, they decide to go back into the cave and tell the people that were there about this amazing world, and most importantly, of this brilliant sun. When they get back into the cave, of course, their eyes are no longer used to the cave light, and they stumble around, and the people down here think the person is mad, foolish, stupid, because they're so clumsy in this world of illusion. And of course, if they could, they would kill him. So this is a parable for anagage, but the parable has some important things we need to take note of. First of all, it helps you to understand what is meant by anagage, where the term comes from. It gives you a visual metaphor for that process I was talking about earlier, about aligning the elements of the psyche, seeing more deeply into the world. That improves your realization, your sight, and then that makes you accommodate more to reality, and you get the virtuous cycle. There's the idea that this culminates, that's exactly the wrong word, the ascent, but not the whole process. The ascent culminates in the vision of the sun. And then there's the third part is the person immediately feels an obligation to try and bring this possibility of the passage upward to the people below, but they have a terrific time. That's maybe the wrong way to put it. They have a terrible time trying to understand him. He has a terrible time trying to make himself understood because they can't understand a lot of the relevance of what he's saying because they're still chained to a very narrow framing. Okay, so what we need to do is to try and map that metaphor onto deeper aspects, this parable onto deeper aspects of Plato's theory. Now, the point is it's a parable. It sort of makes sense, and then at the end, or at least parts of it, point to things that actually transcend the story that's being told. All right. So, what are these real patterns, and what's happening as we are rising above ourselves, right? Rising above where we used to be. We're engaged in self-transcendence. All the metaphors that have become so common for us. This is where they have their at least origin in literature. So, what Plato is trying to get us to see is he's trying to get us to see that there's something deeply going on when we realize the truth. We're picking up, as I said, on these real patterns, and Plato has a term for these real patterns. He calls it the eidos. We get our word idea from it, but that's deeply, deeply misleading. Okay? So I'm going to use the Greek word eidos. It's often translated as the English word form. People hear shape, and shape is only a metaphor, so don't hear shape. It's closer to like formula, but a better way of thinking about this is this brings together four notions. It brings together the notion of a principle, a pattern, but the patterns aren't sort of just inert. They're powerful, they're active, almost like the way thoughts are patterns with power behind them. That's where we get, that's the association to an idea. An idea is a living pattern in our mind. These are living patterns in the world and in our mind. And then also like a paradigm. So if you think of these all together, this is what Plato's talking about when he's talking about the real patterns, the real things, the real beings. So we are often looking at the shadows and the echoes of the real patterns rather than turning and realizing the real patterns without and then also within. So let me try and give you a way of understanding what these real patterns mean. Obviously, one child of Plato's notion of an eidos is the scientific notion of a law. And if you think about a law, like, let's say here, this is a principle, E equals mc squared. Okay, it's not an event, it's not an object, it's not a thing, there's no place where there's happening. This doesn't have a shape or a size, that doesn't make any sense. It's a principle. But it's not just some sort of descriptive principle, it's actually a power. It is the way in which the universe is shaped. It's the way in which things are, what's possible in the universe is constrained. That's what power means, how we shape possibility. It obviously is a particular pattern. It's a pattern relating energy, matter, and the speed of light. And it's a paradigm. It tells us ultimately how things are to be best understood. Okay? And I'm not saying that everything that Plato calls an eidos is a scientific law, but scientific laws are really good examples. And when I ask you this, do you think this is real? And there's a sense in which this is more real than this object or this body, because this describes how everything ultimately behaves. This is a source, not a thing though, this is a source from which everything else is emerging. It's like the real objects, and all of these things are the shadows that are being cast on the wall of the cave. Okay, let's draw it a little bit more, because for Plato, this process of realizing the forms, the eidos, is a process that we experience as love, and we experience it as beauty. So why love? Well, think about when you're in love with somebody. When I'm in love with someone, I internalize them. I take them into the heart of my being, and that reorganizes my psyche. It reorganizes how I am. My identity is changed. And that identification allows me to see more deeply into my partner. And my partner then will disclose more to me. And I'm doing that for her. And so what happens is I see more deeply into her, and then she is taken more deeply into my psyche. So I see more deeply into her, and she is taken more deeply into my psyche. And this is called mutually accelerating disclosure. When you have that, you love something. So I love this, I love Shakespeare. Well, why? I'm reading Shakespeare, and I don't just take in some ideas. It really starts to shape my understanding of myself, and I start to reshape myself. I go out and live in the world, and then I come back to Shakespeare. Oh, and I see things in Shakespeare I didn't see before. And so I take Shakespeare's ideas more deeply in. And then I see more deeply into Shakespeare, and I fall in love with Shakespeare. I fall in love with another person. So one way of understanding Neoplatonism is to try and get you to learn how to fall in love with what is most real. And we all say, oh, but of course, yes, at one level, that's what we all want, the meta drive. But Plato's criticism is, and he gets this from Socrates, is, but we actually don't live our lives in order to fall in love with what is most real. And therefore, ultimately, we don't get that inner fullness of being, and we don't get that sense of being in contact with what is most real. Okay, so, and then of course there's a reciprocal relationship between this, and we have lost that in our culture too. We always think of beauty as what's causing us to love, at least when we have what we call sort of the popular culture version. Oh wow, so beautiful, I love her. But what typically happens when you move out of just salience and infatuation, and you really get to know, listen to my language, get to know the person, it starts to go the other way. Because you love them, and because you're realizing them, they become more beautiful to you. So it starts to cycle. The beauty draws the love, but the love draws out the beauty. So I'm trying to give you many different ways in which you can see this practically impacting on your life. So, one way of thinking about these real patterns, therefore, are the patterns that afford us falling in love with what is most real, so that what is most real becomes more and more beautiful to us and turns our attention from illusory patterns, so that we are more and more naturally able to look at and be drawn to what is most real. And this is the ascent out of the cave until our eyes are eventually drawn to what's ultimately real, which is what the sun is an analogy for. All right, so I want you to think of beauty as a way of trying to understand the eidos. So there's a lot of really good work on beauty. Alan Scarry has just an amazing book. So let's do it. Okay. So you come upon a tree, and the tree strikes you as beautiful. It's from outside of your egocentric framework. It strikes you. It flashes on you. It's beautiful. And what happens is, in your mind, right? All the other trees that you've ever seen are making it possible for you to see this tree, but all those other trees are inadequate, because you realize, wow, I didn't know that trees could be like this. Right? And so what happens is, all the other trees are gathered in your mind, but you realize that there's something more to being a tree than that entire set. There's something beyond. So here's the set of all the trees, and they are all pointing towards this beautiful tree, but something is happening, and you're pointing beyond to something even more. There's a moreness. Wow, I didn't realize that trees could be like that. So when you have that kind of experience of a thing, where all the previous instances point to it, but you are then pointed beyond it to something that you hadn't seen before, that's when you're starting to get a sense of the eidos. Beauty is a way in which things are disclosed. Now, of course, but I can find things beautiful in a deceptive way. That's right. And so the point is, you have to train what you find beautiful so that you properly fall in love with what's most real. So let's try and zero in on this a little bit more. So what's a bird? Well, when you ask people, they'll say, it has wings, it has feathers, and it flies. But if I would just, here, on this lectern, put a couple wings, a bunch of feathers, and then I throw them up in the air, is that a bird? No, it's ugly and horrific. It is not beautiful in any way, because what's missing is the eidos. What's missing is the logos. What's missing is the structural functional organization by which all the pieces fit together so that they are one. So they belong together. They make sense together, and they make bird together. They make sense together, and they make bird together. It's simultaneously what makes it a bird, and it's what makes that thing knowable as a bird. It makes bird, and it makes sense together. The intelligibility and the being are linked in the eidos. The eidos is precisely that process, that logos by which the things are gathered so that it is a bird, and by which you can understand it and relate to it as a bird. When we make artifacts and we're trying to make them beautiful, notice what we're trying to do. We're trying to get a relationship between intelligibility, how the thing makes sense to us, so we can recognize it, recognize it, and the function of the thing, how it acts. So let's say I'm trying to make a really beautiful chair. Now I can make this object, and it turns out you can sit on it, right? But people don't recognize it as a chair, right? Maybe it's some weird thing. And what? That's a chair? Right? Doesn't make sense to me as a chair. Oh, I see how you can sit on it, right? Or you could have something that's really sort of ornate and, trying to make it beautiful, but I can't actually use it as a chair. It doesn't function as a chair. It's like, well, that's not a good chair. What am I trying to get? I'm trying to get a structural functional organization that makes it simultaneously recognizable by you, realizable by you as a chair, and has it actually function and behave as a chair. Now, if it's a really amazing chair, right, and it makes you think of all the previous chairs you've ever seen, but points you to, wow, I didn't realize chairs could be like this, to the something more, then you've got the eidos of a chair, or you've got the eidos of a bird. And Plato's idea is we actually understand things by making often an implicit comparison between whatever the thing is we encounter, and this is like the shadow or the echo, and this eidos. That's how you know why you make judgments like, that's not a very good chair. That's not a very good bird. And you know that that's not a very good circle. And you know that any circle I draw is actually inadequate. That there could be a better circle. So what is this? That's you coming out of the cave. Your understanding is actually, when it's opening up to reality, when it's trying to realize, it's doing that. It's ascending out of the cave. That's what the eidos are. And so for Plato, all of the objects we see participate in the eidos. Just like everything participates in E equals mc squared, or participates in force equals mass times acceleration, or participates in the conservation of energy and matter. Everything is also, right, every bird is participating in that pattern that makes birds possible and makes birds possible to be known. But that pattern is never exhausted by any instance. There could be more, there's more to it. There's always more to it. The fact that the world never stops producing new understanding and new beauty is Plato's great argument that there is so much more than what we take to be the final story of things. Everything is ultimately participating in this greater, more real set of patterns. Then Plato has the idea that for all of these patterns or principles, right, all these laws, these are all different ways of trying to talk about the same thing. There's ultimately the principle of how to be a pattern itself. There's something that makes all the patterns possible so that they all logos fit together, belong together, work together as one. That, of course, corresponds to the sun in the analogy. That would be the most real thing of all, because everything is participating in it. Everything is being realized by it. Plato calls this the good. Not ethical good. This is the goodness of being itself. Something we've been tasting from the beginning as Epicurean practicers. The Neoplatonists called it the one. And the idea behind this is, it is like whenever we're understanding something, here's a bunch of things. Oh, there's the pattern underneath them. Here's a bunch of things. Oh, there's the pattern. Understanding. Substance underneath, right? Oh, here's the pattern. Oh, here's the pattern. Oh, look, there's a pattern under these. Oh, look, there's a pattern. Look what we're doing. We're oneing things in order to get to the deepest pattern. So for Plato, this isn't abstract thought or just sort of a romantic feeling. This is a disciplined practice of reflection that gets you to do what we're like. And this is what I mean. Science is trying to do this. Great literature is trying to do this. Great art is trying to do this. And this is Plato's great insight. So great spirituality should be trying to do this and do it more deeply than our science, our art, right? So that's what Neoplatonism takes from Plato. Now that's way more than what it takes from, I had to say a lot about that because that's the guts of Neoplatonism. This profound vision of what is possible for human beings. This idea that we can find the best possible life by falling in love with real patterns, going through the anagogic process of coming to deeply realize, not as just an idea, but as a process of enlightenment, what is most real. So what did the Neoplatonists take from Aristotle, Plato's greatest disciple? Aristotle made something very explicit that was implicit in Plato. He came up with how we really know something, and we really know something by realizing its form. But you need both senses of this word. Realizing its eidos. This is where we get the notion, and we have just reduced this notion, like everything else, the notion of conformity. So for Aristotle, to know something is to actually internalize its form, its eidos, its structural functional organization. So which of these two people really knows what a chair is? Somebody who can give you a description of a chair? That's what we think these days. Aristotle says, no, that doesn't, right? Somebody who can make a chair. Somebody who can give a piece of wood the structural functional organization that makes it be a chair and makes it intelligible as a chair and does it well together so that it's a beautiful chair. It makes me realize that there's more to being a chair than I had thought before. The person who can do that really knows what a chair is. Well, that means they have the eidos in their mind that is going to be in the chair. They are sharing the form, conformity, sharing the eidos. So to know something is actually to participate in its eidos. This is knowing by being at one with something. So if I'm oneing myself, at least my mind, in a way that conforms to how this thing is oneing itself, then I'm at one with it, and then I really realize it and know it. The reverse is the case for Aristotle, and this is what the Neoplatonists really picked up on. Knowing is not just taking in information. By the way, this comes right out of Aristotle and Plato. There it is again, information. What is knowing? Well, here's the idea. If I'm living in the cave, my mind is conformed to the shadows and the echoes. What I set myself to know determines the range of what I can be. And again, this isn't knowledge in the sense of gathering facts. This is knowledge about falling in love so that you can be at one with something. And if I stay at the level of the monster, the superficial patterns in my life, that's all I can be. Because unless I realize the deeper patterns, I will not be realized as a deeper human being. So how we know actually transforms who we are. And so we have to recover, according to Aristotle, but more importantly, according to the Neoplatonists, we have to recover ways of knowing that we have lost. They put it like remembering, and there's a kind of truth to that. If we don't like that, we can say we have to cultivate ways of knowing that will afford us falling in love with what is more deeply real within and without. And we have to go from this, talking about it, to realizing it, recognizing it, and disclosing it. Discerning those patterns so that they shine more into us. Like when we see the beautiful tree, the moreness shines into this particular tree, because this particular tree is participating in the moreness. So from Aristotle, we get the idea that we need to be making sense in order to realize, not just to get information that we can use, but we can train ourselves to make sense so that things become more deeply realizable, real to us, and we make ourselves as something other than we currently are. And we have lost this. We have reduced information to just facts, and we have reduced knowledge to just the consumption and the accumulation of facts. And so the Neoplatonist wisdom tradition is to try and recover from from all of the information, the reality that it is so the information, in our sense, participates in information in the Aristotelian sense, which points to the ultimate transformation of ourselves and the world so that we can fall in love with the deepest patterns of reality. So next time, we're almost done. Next time I want to say what the Neoplatonists have taken from Stoicism. And then we'll start talking about how to put this into practice. And we will start talking about how this practice, how this ecology of practices basically gathers up and brings to fruition the practices within Epicureanism and Stoicism, and also how this Western ecology of practices could be compared and integrated in true friendship with the wisdom traditions that we have cultivated in gratitude from Buddhism and Taoism. Okay, I'm going to return to the Zafu. So do we have any questions that are new here? I've already answered two of these last time. I think there's a bit of confusion here. So I think yep, I've answered that one already. Yep. And then the next one, I think they just weren't marked last time. Sorry for the slight delay. This is a new question. This is from Nemes R, I think. How can you collect evidence of principles or systems influencing things? Does studying emergent structures change the way you should frame your research? Yes, I do think that there's two kinds of study you should engage in. There's the kind of study that's ultimately scientific, broadly construed, in which you are using the best practices we have for distinguishing causation from correlation, and then distinguishing the causal patterns that are most general from those that are most local. And that's how we move to this notion of the structures and the laws. And so you need to do that, but you need a way of thinking about these emerging structures that helps you deal with the dynamic emergence of them. And so there's a lot of good work going on using what's called dynamical systems theory, and I talk about this in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis as a way of trying to understand these emerging structures. But you also have to study them in how can I more deeply and truly conform my cognition and consciousness to pick up on these emergent structures that reflect, that participate in sort of the deeper aspects of reality. And that's what we're going to be trying to do in the remaining classes of the Wisdom of Hypatia course. So, and I would argue, and Aristotle and Plotinus would agree with me, and this is one way in which I think this is different from how a lot of people approach spirituality right now. These two studies, the scientific study and the sapiential, sapience having to do with wisdom, Homo sapien, man the wise, right? Sapience. So the scientific study and the sapiential study have to be deeply interwoven and mutually interdependent and constantly evolving, because as we get wiser, as we become wiser scientists, we actually practice science better. Notice the anagoge again. And as we practice science better, we start to get a deeper understanding of the phenomena, which helps us conform better to them and become wiser. Now, this is all easily said, and it is terrifically difficult to do, but you don't just leap into it. You don't just go to university. You practice a lot, right? In primary school, Epicureanism. You practice a lot in high school, Stoicism. You have the bridging practices that we've talked about. You have other experience of transformation of consciousness and cognition from Buddhism and Taoism, and then you can bring that together to understand in practice. So you recognize, right? You can understand in practice what Neoplatonism is presenting to you as an option for how to become more fully human. So, another question from Pleasure of Doubt from Brett. Sorry, this is just the end of a question, so I can't make sense of it. It's just cut off from a previous question. So I'm sorry, Brett. I think that question, I answered your question last time. It was the question about how to keep going with practices. Here's one from Robert Gray. Sorry, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. If John's doing questions today, how does today's talk relate to intrinsic versus attributed property in the process of categorization? Yes. So I think very much and this is why I kept using scientific analogies. Science is a subset, a species of the genus, the genus, not the genre, of the genus of realization. It's a particularly theoretical way of doing this. There's other ways of doing it, which I'm alluding to. All of these processes are processes by trying to see how things are intrinsically, independently from the ways in which they just exist in attributed fashion. So there's things that only exist because we all agree to pretend together. Think about people in the cave, that they exist. So money only exists in an attributed fashion. We don't even carry them around. We used to have objects. We don't really even have objects anymore. We just have abstract, like signs, little numbers in places that on computer screens. It's really kind of weird. And so money doesn't exist unless we all agree it does. That's why if I give you a piece of paper from the Confederacy in the American Civil War, it's not worth anything because the Confederacy doesn't exist. Or you're in the Weimar Republic and the Deutschmark goes from, like, I could buy a bicycle with 100 Deutschmark, and by the end of the day, I can't buy a postage stamp because of hyperinflation, right? So it doesn't intrinsically exist. It only exists because we all pretend it exists together. Now, it's a useful pretense because it's a pretense that we engage in together because it helps smooth out trade and commerce, etc. But think about how we could forget that. And we could somehow do the fallacy of thinking that money is more real than the people that are actually the source of its existence. We would be confusing the shadow with the source, and we would be living our lives conforming to something less real than conforming to what is more real. We would be attaching ourselves to the attributed shadows rather than find the intrinsically existing sources. And people do this a lot, and it's myself included, and that's Plato's point. We say we want to fall in love with reality, but we actually really often fall in love, but not in that opening way, but in that reciprocally narrowing way. And so it's not really love, it's the perversion of love, but we fall in love with the shadows and the echoes. And then we are cut off from ourselves, from each other, and from the depths of the world. And there's no mythological hell worse than that. But remember the problem, when people are in that cave, and when you try to tell them that that's not actually how they should pay attention, how they should realize, they think you're a fool. They think you're a fool. Okay, so last question for today. The original Naked Blonde writer, Tracy. Always a pleasure. Hi, John. It's Tracy here in Wales. Hello, Tracy. Why did you choose McClellan's book, Wisdom of Hypatia? What is it about this book that spoke to you? I have completed a first read and love it. So what spoke to me about this book was its comprehensiveness. And what spoke to me about it was he is actually, like myself, a cognitive scientist, and so he's trying to bring in as much of a scientific attitude as possible. He's willing to explore the depths of this, but he's also wants to approach it rationally and then trans-rationally. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, just hang on. But trans-rational is when you're looking at the sun. So that spoke to me. The fact that it's a precisely worked out pedagogical program where one thing builds on and affords the next, rather than just giving you this theory and say, okay, practice, right? So it's very much like what I did with you guys for, the meditation and the contemplation. It's a course, it's a developmental course, so that each time you take a step, you come to understand in a new way that affords you taking the next step, and so on, and so on. That's why many of you fell in love with the kind of person you are and the kind of world you can be in that meditation and contemplation showed you. That's an anagogic process. And I saw McClellan working really hard with really clear language and examples to build a pedagogy that tapped into what I consider three of the four main wisdom traditions from the West. He doesn't really talk very much about Aristotle, but he does talk about Epicureanism and Stoicism and Neoplatonism. So I just love the book for that. That set of the clarity, the pedagogical program, the progression, the tapping into, I think, really good and core representations of each one of these traditions and translating them very readily and I think succinctly and powerfully into practices that we can engage in, so we can actually embody and enact these paths to the cultivation of wisdom, rather than just reading about them and analyzing their arguments and blah and blah and blah. Right? We've done that. It didn't do anything. We learned a lot, but it didn't do anything for making people wiser. This was Pierre Hadot's great argument. We have to recover ancient philosophy, not as a set of facts about arguments that we can then spew at dinner parties. We have to recover it as deeply transformative ways of seeing and being, of realizing. Philosophia is ultimately a deeply and profoundly spiritual practice, not just an intellectual or academic practice. And that was clearly present to me when I was reading McClellan's book. I got that. And Pierre Hadot has a direct influence on that book, so that's why I chose it. Okay, so I know that some of you are like, we're not doing any practices yet. I get that. Read the McClellan, right? He's giving you practices already. Go ahead, reach ahead. That's fine. I've got to work towards it. And he's also giving you his background. And I think you should use them as like stereoscopic lenses. Look at his presentation, and he presents it in stages of the background of Neoplatonism. Look at mine, integrate them together, start to do some of the practices. And I'm going to be soon taking you into the practices. I promise. So thank you very much for joining. Thank you so much to Amar, my techno mage, dear friend, my beloved son Jason, who's making this all work. Please subscribe to the channel to be notified of the next video. Please invite people on Twitter for updates. Invite others who might benefit by joining this series. Remember, we're doing this every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. There's not very many of these left. We have maybe 3 or 4 more classes left, and then we'll be done the Wisdom of Hypatia. And I look forward to completing at least this educational part of your journey, getting you finished in university so then you can go into the world. So thank you very much. So remember, continuity of practice more important than sheer quantity of practice. Don't hold yourself to the standard of harsh perfectionism. You're never going to see the sun completely. You can't. Don't hold yourself to that standard. Instead, hold yourself to the standard of virtuous friendship, walking the path with yourself and with others. Because in the end, there is no friend, no companion on the path that is a truer friend, a truer companion than your own mind and body. Because they will give you the deepest realization possible. Be lamps unto yourselves, lamps shining forth, leading you onward and to each other. Take good care, everyone. I'll see you next week.